The Bronze Age marked a time when human societies moved beyond simple stone tools and entered an era of sophisticated metal technology, complex urban centres, and interconnected civilizations. This period witnessed the rise of the first true empires, the development of writing systems, and the establishment of trade networks that spanned continents. The Bronze Age takes its name from the revolutionary alloy that defined the era. Bronze, created by combining copper with tin, represented a quantum leap in human technological capability. This metal was harder and more durable than pure copper, yet easier to cast and shape than the iron that would eventually replace it. The discovery and widespread adoption of bronze technology fundamentally altered how humans lived, worked, fought, and organized their societies. The timeline of the Bronze Age varied considerably across different regions of the world. In the ancient Near East, particularly in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Bronze Age began around 3,300 years before the Common Era. In the Aegean region, encompassing Greece and Crete, bronze technology arrived somewhat later, around 3,000 years before the Common Era. Britain and Northern Europe experienced their Bronze Age beginning around 1900 years before the Common Era. China developed its own distinct Bronze Age culture starting approximately 1700 years before the Common Era during the Shang dynasty. This temporal variation reflects an important reality about ancient technological development. Bronze Age cultures did not emerge simultaneously across the globe. Instead, the knowledge of bronze making spread gradually through trade routes, migration, and cultural contact. Some regions developed bronze technology independently, while others acquired it through interaction with more advanced neighbours. The uneven distribution of tin and copper deposits also meant that some societies had easier access to the raw materials necessary for bronze production than others. The geographical scope of the Bronze Age encompassed vast territories across the ancient world. The heartland of Bronze Age civilization stretched from the eastern Mediterranean through Mesopotamia and into the Iranian plateau. Egypt along the Nile River developed its own distinctive Bronze Age culture. The Aegean Sea became home to the Minoan civilization on Crete and the Mycenaean culture on mainland Greece. Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, saw the rise of the powerful Hittite Empire. Further east, the Indus Valley and China developed their own Bronze Age societies with unique characteristics. Understanding the Bronze Age requires recognizing that this period represented more than simply a change in the materials used for tools and weapons. The adoption of bronze technology catalyzed profound transformations in social organization, economic systems, and political structures. Bronze weapons gave military advantages to those who possessed them, driving the formation of armies and the consolidation of political power. Bronze agricultural tools increased food production, allowing populations to grow and cities to expand. The specialized knowledge required to produce bronze created new classes of craftsmen and merchants, contributing to increasingly stratified societies. The Bronze Age also witnessed the emergence of writing systems, one of humanity's most significant achievements. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform script developed to track economic transactions and record religious texts. Egyptian hieroglyphics served similar purposes along the Nile. The Minoans of Crete created Linear A, while the Mycenaeans adapted this into Linear B to write an early form of Greek. In China, oracle bone script emerged during the Shang dynasty. These writing systems allowed for the preservation of knowledge, the codification of laws, and the documentation of history. Trade networks expanded dramatically during the Bronze Age, connecting distant regions in unprecedented ways. Merchants transported tin from Afghanistan and Cornwall to copper-rich regions across thousands of miles. Amber from the Baltic reached the Mediterranean. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan adorned Egyptian treasures. These trade routes facilitated not just the exchange of goods, but also the transmission of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The Bronze Age world became increasingly interconnected, with civilizations dependent on one another for essential resources. This period also saw the development of complex religious and mythological systems. The gods and goddesses of Bronze Age civilizations reflected the concerns and values of their societies. Storm gods held prominence in many cultures, reflecting the agricultural foundation of these societies and their dependence on rainfall. Temple complexes became centers of economic and political power. Religious rituals and festivals structured the calendar and brought communities together. Many of the mythological traditions that emerged during the Bronze Age would continue to influence later cultures for millennia. Architecture reached new heights during this period. the Egyptians constructed the magnificent pyramids that still stand today as testaments to Bronze Age engineering capabilities. Mesopotamian ziggurats rose toward the heavens, serving as temples and administrative centres. Minoan palaces on Crete featured sophisticated drainage systems and multiple stories. Mycenaean citadels boasted massive stone walls built with such precision that later Greeks attributed them to the work of giants. These monumental structures required not just advanced construction techniques, but also the ability to organise and feed large workforces over extended periods. The Bronze Age was also a period of significant military innovation. Bronze weapons transformed warfare, allowing for the creation of professional armies equipped with standardised gear. The chariot, combining bronze technology with domesticated horses, revolutionised battlefield tactics. Fortification walls protected cities from attack, while siege warfare developed as armies sought ways to breach these defences. The increased scale and sophistication of warfare drove the formation of larger political units and more centralised power structures. Social hierarchies became more pronounced during the Bronze Age. At the top stood kings and pharaohs, often claiming divine authority. Below them, a noble class controlled land and resources. Priests wielded religious authority and managed temple complexes. Scribes formed a literate elite capable of recording and transmitting knowledge. Craftsmen, particularly those skilled in metallurgy, occupied specialised economic niches. Merchants facilitated trade across long distances. Farmers formed the economic foundation, producing the agricultural surplus that supported all other classes. At the bottom, enslaved individuals and prisoners of war provided labour for major construction projects and agricultural work. The legacy of the Bronze Age extends far beyond the period itself. Many of the fundamental structures of civilization that emerged during this era continued to shape human societies for thousands of years. The concept of empire, first realised by Sargon of Akkad, became a recurring form of political organisation. Legal codes like that of Hammurabi established precedents for written law. Writing systems evolved but remained essential tools for administration and cultural transmission. Trade networks expanded but followed routes first established during the Bronze Age. Even religious and mythological traditions showed remarkable continuity, with Bronze Age gods and stories influencing later Greek, Roman, and other cultures. The transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age represented one of the most significant technological revolutions in human history. The discovery that copper and tin could be combined to create bronze opened new possibilities for toolmaking, weapon manufacture, and artistic expression. This section explores how bronze technology developed, spread, and transformed daily life across the ancient world. Pure copper had been worked by human societies for thousands of years before the Bronze Age began. Archaeological evidence indicates that copper smelting was known in eastern Anatolia by 6,500 years before the Common Era. Early metalworkers discovered that copper ore could be heated to high temperatures to extract the pure metal. This process, called smelting, required specialized knowledge of firing techniques and temperature control. Initially, copper objects were rare and precious, limited to small items like beads, pins, and decorative objects. However, pure copper had significant limitations as material for tools and weapons. Copper is relatively soft, meaning that copper blades would bend or deform under stress. Copper axes would lose their edge quickly when used for chopping wood. While copper tools represented an improvement over stone in some respects, they were not durable enough to completely replace stone implements. This limitation meant that copper remained a supplementary material rather than a transformative one. The breakthrough came with the discovery that adding tin to copper created an alloy with superior properties. Bronze, typically consisting of 90% copper and 10% tin, was significantly harder than pure copper, while remaining workable. Bronze could hold a sharp edge much longer than copper. It was less brittle than stone, meaning bronze tools would not shatter under impact. Bronze could be cast into complex shapes using molds, allowing for standardized production of tools and weapons. These properties made bronze the ideal material for the ancient world. The exact circumstances of bronze's discovery remain unknown, but it likely occurred through experimentation with different ores. Some copper ores naturally contained small amounts of tin or arsenic, which would have produced a harder metal when smelted. Ancient metalworkers may have noticed these superior properties and experimented with deliberately adding tin to copper. The knowledge of bronze making then spread through trade networks and cultural contact, transforming societies that adopted the technology. Creating bronze required mastering several complex processes. First, miners had to locate and extract copper and tin ores from the earth. Copper deposits were relatively common in the ancient world, found in regions like Cyprus, the Sinai Peninsula, and various locations in Anatolia and the Iranian Plateau. Tin, however, was much rarer. Major tin sources included Cornwall in southwestern Britain, the Erzgebirge Mountains in Central Europe, and deposits in Afghanistan and southeastern Asia. This scarcity of tin drove long-distance trade and made tin a valuable commodity. Once the ores were obtained, they had to be processed. Copper ore was crushed and then heated in furnaces to temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius. The copper would separate from the rocky matrix and collect at the bottom of the furnace. Tin ore underwent a similar process. The two metals were then melted together in carefully controlled proportions to create bronze. This alloying process required precise temperature control and knowledge of the correct ratios. After creating bronze, metal workers employed various techniques to shape it into useful objects. The most common method was casting, where molten bronze was poured into molds made of clay, stone, or metal. These molds could be simple open forms for basic shapes or complex piece molds for intricate objects. The lost wax method, developed during the Bronze Age, allowed for the creation of highly detailed bronze sculptures and ritual objects. In this technique, a wax model was covered in clay, then the clay was fired to harden it and melt out the wax, leaving a hollow mold into which bronze could be poured. Cold working techniques were also important. Bronze could be hammered while cold to shape it, a process that also made the metal harder through work hardening. However, this hammering would eventually make the bronze brittle, so metalworkers would periodically anneal the metal by heating and cooling it to restore malleability. Edges could be sharpened by grinding, and surfaces could be polished to a high sheen. These various techniques allowed Bronze Age craftsmen to create objects ranging from simple tools to elaborate works of art. The impact of bronze technology on agriculture was profound and transformative. Bronze ploughs revolutionized farming by allowing farmers to break up harder soils that were previously uncultivatable. Unlike wooden ploughs, which would wear down or break when encountering rocks or tough ground, bronze ploughshares maintained their shape and sharpness. This meant that farmers could work their fields more efficiently and bring new land under cultivation. Bronze sickles made harvesting crops much faster and easier. The sharp bronze blade could cut through grain stalks cleanly, and the curved shape allowed farmers to gather handfuls of grain with each stroke. Bronze hoes enabled more effective weeding and soil cultivation. Bronze axes cleared forests for new farmland much more quickly than stone axes. All of these innovations increased agricultural productivity, allowing Bronze Age societies to produce food surpluses. These agricultural surpluses had far-reaching consequences. With more food available, populations could grow larger. More importantly, agricultural surpluses freed segments of the population from food production. Specialized craftsmen could focus entirely on metalworking, pottery making, or weaving. Priests could devote themselves to religious duties. Scribes could maintain records. Rulers and warriors could focus on administration and defense. This specialization of labor was essential to the development of complex Bronze Age civilizations. Bronze transformed warfare in equally dramatic ways. Bronze weapons were longer, stronger, and more durable than stone weapons. Bronze spearheads could be cast in lengths up to a foot or more, mounted on wooden shafts to create weapons with significant reach. Unlike stone spearheads, which might shatter on impact, bronze spearheads would bend at most and could be straightened for reuse. Bronze swords represented a particularly significant innovation. Stone cannot be shaped into long blades, so Stone Age combat relied on clubs, axes, and daggers. Bronze allowed for the creation of true swords, some reaching lengths of 2 feet or more. These weapons could slash and thrust, giving warriors new tactical options in combat. Bronze swords from the late Bronze Age show remarkable craftsmanship with carefully balanced blades and ornate hilts. Axes evolved from simple tools into specialized weapons. The socketed bronze axe, developed during the Bronze Age, featured a hollowed-out socket into which the wooden shaft could be firmly seated. This design prevented the axe head from flying off during combat or heavy work. Some bronze axes were clearly designed as status symbols or ceremonial objects, with elaborate decorations and impractical shapes, but functional bronze axes remained important military equipment. Defensive equipment also benefited from bronze technology. Bronze helmets protected warriors' heads from blows that would have been fatal. Some bronze helmets were simple caps, while others featured elaborate designs with cheek guards and neck protection. Bronze armour, in the form of breastplates and greaves, provided protection for the torso and legs. However, bronze armour was expensive and heavy, so it likely remained limited to elite warriors and royalty. Bronze shields represented a particular achievement. Most shields were made of wood or leather, but some wealthy warriors possessed shields made from beaten bronze. These bronze shields were remarkably effective. Experiments with replica shields have shown that beaten bronze, when properly worked, could resist penetration from bronze swords and spearheads. The process of beating the bronze altered its internal structure, creating a strong barrier despite the thin metal. The invention of the chariot during the Bronze Age combined bronze technology with the domestication of horses to create a revolutionary weapon system. Chariots featured bronze fittings and were often drawn by horses wearing bronze bits. The riders carried bronze weapons and could rain arrows or throw spears from their moving platform. Chariots gave armies tactical mobility and shock value. The Bronze Age saw the chariot warfare spread across the Near East, Egypt, and eventually into Europe and Asia. Bronze technology also transformed daily life in less dramatic but equally important ways. Bronze needles and pins made sewing and clothing production more efficient. Bronze mirrors, polished to a high shine, allowed people to see their reflections clearly for the first time. Bronze tweezers, razors, and other personal grooming tools improved hygiene and appearance. Bronze vessels for cooking and storage were more durable than pottery and could withstand high temperatures. Bronze also enabled advances in construction and woodworking. Bronze chisels, hammers, and saws allowed craftsmen to work with wood more precisely. Bronze nails and fasteners made stronger joints possible. Bronze tools enabled the construction of more complex buildings and ships. The improvement in the woodworking techniques supported by bronze tools contributed to advances in shipbuilding, which in turn facilitated the expansion of maritime trade. The production of bronze created new economic structures. Metalworking required specialized knowledge and equipment, so bronze smiths formed a distinct occupational class. These craftsmen often enjoyed higher social status than ordinary workers due to their valuable skills. In some societies, metalworkers traveled from place to place, trading their services for food, shelter, and old bronze objects that could be melted down and recast. In larger communities, permanent workshops produced bronze goods for local use and trade. The need for tin and copper also drove the expansion of trade networks. Since tin and copper deposits rarely occurred in the same locations, societies needed to trade to obtain both metals. This created economic incentives for long-distance commerce. Merchants and traders became important figures, carrying bronze goods and raw materials across hundreds or thousands of miles. The search for tin sources was particularly important, with trade routes extending from the Near East to Afghanistan in the east and Cornwall in the west. Bronze objects also served as stores of value and medium of exchange. Before the development of coinage, bronze items could be traded for other goods. Bronze ingots of standardized weights facilitated commerce. In some societies, bronze objects were hoarded as wealth. The practice of burying bronze hoards, either to keep them safe or as ritual offerings, has provided archaeologists with valuable information about Bronze Age metallurgy and economy. The artistic possibilities of bronze inspired Bronze Age craftsmen to create remarkable works of art. Bronze could be cast into intricate shapes, making it ideal for creating sculptures, decorative objects, and ritual items. Bronze Age cultures produced elaborate bronze vessels decorated with complex patterns, animal figures, and mythological and local scenes. Bronze mirrors featured ornate backs with engraved or cast designs. Bronze jewellery, including pins, bracelets, and ornaments, showcased the skill of ancient metalworkers. In China, bronze working reached particularly sophisticated levels. Chinese bronze vessels from the Shang and Zhou dynasties display extraordinary artistry and technical skill. These ritual bronzes, used in ancestor worship and ceremonial contexts, featured elaborate decorations including the Taiyuti mask motif and intricate geometric patterns. The Chinese developed piece mold casting to a high degree of refinement, allowing them to produce bronzes of great complexity and precision. The invention and spread of bronze technology thus represented a cascade of innovations and social changes. The superior properties of bronze made it the material of choice for tools and weapons. The need for copper and tin drove trade and economic development. The specialized knowledge required for bronze working created new social classes and economic structures. The military advantages of bronze weapons influenced political consolidation and empire building, and the artistic possibilities of bronze inspired creativity and craftsmanship. The Bronze Age earned its name, yet, because bronze truly transformed every aspect of ancient life. The region known as Mesopotamia, meaning land between the rivers, cradled some of humanity's first and most influential Bronze Age civilizations. Located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, with extensions into Syria, southeastern Turkey and western Iran, Mesopotamia became home to the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. These peoples created the first true cities, developed the earliest writing systems, established the first empires, and left a legacy that shaped subsequent civilizations for millennia. The Bronze Age in Mesopotamia began around 3,500 years before the Common Era, marked by the development of complex urban settlements and the widespread use of metal tools. The region's fertile river valleys provided ideal conditions for agriculture, while the lack of stone and timber forced Mesopotamians to become innovative in their use of clay, reeds, and imported metals. This combination of agricultural wealth and technological ingenuity created conditions favourable for the rise of civilization. The Sumerians were among the earliest people to create true cities in southern Mesopotamia. By the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, Sumerian city-states like Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and Eridu had emerged as major centres of population and power. These were not simple agricultural villages, but complex urban settlements with populations in the tens of thousands. Uruk alone may have housed 40,000 people at its height. Each Sumerian city-state functioned as an independent political entity, though they shared a common culture, language, and religious system. At the centre of each city stood a massive temple complex dedicated to the city's patron deity. These temples, called ziggurats, were stepped pyramid structures built from mud bricks that could rise to heights of 100 feet or more. The ziggurat served not just as a religious site, but as an economic and administrative centre. Temple priests managed agricultural land, stored grain reserves, organised labour, and conducted trade. Sumerian society was highly stratified. At the top sat the ruler, who held both political and religious authority. Different cities used different titles for their leaders, including Lugal, meaning great man, and Ensi, meaning governor or priest-king. Below the ruler stood a class of nobles, priests, and wealthy landowners. Scribes formed a literate elite, trained in the complex cuneiform writing system. Merchants and craftsmen occupied the middle levels of society. Farmers and labourers formed the base of the social pyramid, while enslaved people and war prisoners occupied the lowest positions. The Sumerians are credited with developing cuneiform, the world's first writing system. Initially created around 3,200 years before the Common Era to track economic transactions, cuneiform evolved from simple pictographic symbols into a sophisticated writing system capable of expressing complex ideas. Scribes used reed styluses to press wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets. These tablets, when dried or fired, became permanent records. Cuneiform was used to record everything from business contracts and legal judgments to mathematical calculations, religious hymns, and epic poetry. Sumerian innovations extended far beyond writing. They developed advanced mathematics, using a base 60 number system that gave us the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle. They created sophisticated irrigation systems to control the unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates, digging canals, building dikes, and developing water management techniques that allowed intensive agriculture. They crafted elaborate jewellery, produced beautiful pottery decorated with geometric and animal designs, and created some of the earliest known narrative art. The Sumerians also left us literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving written stories. This epic tells of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and his quest for immortality. The story includes themes of friendship, loss, the relationship between humans and gods, and the meaning of mortality. Parts of the Gilgamesh epic, particularly the flood narrative, bear striking similarities to later biblical stories, suggesting cultural transmission and shared traditions. Warfare was endemic among the Sumerian city-states. Competition for water resources, agricultural land, and political dominance drove frequent conflicts. Archaeological evidence and ancient texts describe battles between cities, with rulers boasting of their victories and territorial conquests. The stele of vultures, dating to around 2,400 years before the Common Era, depicts the army of Lagash crushing its enemies in a phalanx formation, one of the earliest depictions of organised warfare. In the 24th century before the Common Era, the political landscape of Mesopotamia changed dramatically with the rise of Sargon of Akkad. Sargon was a Semitic-speaking ruler from the city of Akkad, whose exact location remains undiscovered, but likely lay along the Euphrates between modern Baghdad and Babylon. According to legend, Sargon began life as a gardener who rose to become cupbearer to the king of Kish before seizing power himself. Whether the legend is true or not, Sargon proved to be one of history's great conquerors. Starting around 2300, 34 years before the Common Era, Sargon embarked on a series of military campaigns that united Mesopotamia under his rule. He defeated the Sumerian cities of the south, overthrew their rulers, and appointed his own governors. He campaigned to the north into Anatolia and Syria, to the east into Elam, and to the west reaching the Mediterranean coast. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, encompassing most of the known civilized world of his time. The Akkadian Empire represents the first true empire in history, a multi-ethnic state united under centralized rule. Sargon replaced local rulers with appointed governors loyal to him, established a professional standing army, and made Akkadian the language of administration alongside Sumerian. He built roads to connect his empire, established trade routes, and accumulated wealth through tribute and conquest. The Akkadian Empire created a model of imperial organization that would be emulated by later empires for thousands of years. Sargon's dynasty ruled for approximately 140 years, through his sons Ramesh and Manishtusu, his grandson Naram-Sin, and great-grandson Shar-Kali-Shari. Naram-Sin, who ruled around 2254 to 2218 years before the Common Era, was particularly successful, expanding the empire even further and declaring himself a god. However, the Akkadian Empire faced increasing pressure from mountain peoples called the Gutians, internal rebellions, and possibly climate change that brought drought to the region. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2154 years before the Common Era plunged Mesopotamia into a period of chaos. The Gutians from the Zagros Mountains invaded and destroyed Akkad itself. Various cities reasserted independence. This period of fragmentation lasted perhaps a century, though chronologies remain uncertain. Eventually, the city of in southern Mesopotamia rose to prominence, inaugurating what historians call the Third Dynasty of or the III period. Under rulers like Namu and Shulgi, the Palm Kingdom reunited much of Mesopotamia from around 2112 to 2004 years before the Common Era. Namu created one of the earliest known law codes, establishing legal precedents and principles of justice. The III state developed a highly bureaucratic administration, with detailed records kept on clay tablets tracking everything from livestock counts to labour assignments. This period saw a renaissance of Sumerian culture and literature, though Akkadian remained important as well. The III period came to an end around 2004 years before the Common Era, when Elamites from the east sacked and carried away its last king. Simultaneously, Amorite peoples from the west began settling in Mesopotamia in large numbers. These new arrivals established their own dynasties in various cities, leading to another period of political fragmentation. However, this fragmentation was temporary. One Amorite dynasty, ruling from the previously minor city of Babylon, would rise to dominate Mesopotamia. Babylon first gained prominence under Hammurabi, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 years before the Common Era. Hammurabi inherited a small kingdom, but through military campaigns and diplomatic maneuvering, expanded Babylonian control to encompass most of Mesopotamia. He defeated the cities of Larsa, Mari, and Eshnunna, uniting the land under Babylonian rule. Babylon became the dominant power in Mesopotamia, a position it would hold intermittently for over 1,000 years. Hammurabi is best known for his law code, one of the most complete legal texts to survive from the ancient world. The Code of Hammurabi consisted of 282 laws inscribed on a large stone stele. These laws covered property rights, trade regulations, family relations, criminal justice, and many other aspects of daily life. The code operated on a principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, embodied in the famous phrase "an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." However, the code also showed concern for protecting the weak from the powerful and maintaining social order. The legal code was not intended to be a complete system of law, but rather a collection of exemplary cases and precedents. It demonstrated Hammurabi's role as a just ruler maintaining order and fairness in his realm. The code reveals much about Babylonian society, showing clear distinctions between social classes with different penalties for the same crime depending on the social status of perpetrator and victim. It also protected certain economic rights and regulated commercial relationships. In northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrians developed their own powerful kingdom. Assyria, centered on the cities of Assur and Nineveh along the Tigris River, had long been involved in long-distance trade. During the Bronze Age, Assyrian merchants established trading colonies in Anatolia, exchanging textiles and tin for silver and gold. These commercial activities brought wealth to Assyria and spread Mesopotamian culture into Anatolia. The Old Assyrian period gave way to the Middle Assyrian Empire, which rose to prominence in the 14th and 13th centuries before the Common Era. Under rulers like Ashur-uballit-Fursins, Adad-nirari-Werns, Tukulti-Ninurta-Pharaoh, and Tiglath-Pileser-Werner, Assyria became a major military power. The Assyrians developed a reputation as fierce warriors, building a professional army equipped with advanced bronze weapons and chariots. They conquered territories in Anatolia, Syria, and Babylonia, establishing Assyria as one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. Assyrian kings left detailed annals describing their military campaigns, often in brutal terms. These texts boast of cities captured, enemies killed, and territories annexed. Assyrian art depicts the king as a mighty warrior, hunting lions and leading armies into battle. The military focus of Assyrian culture set it apart from other Mesopotamian societies and foreshadowed the even more militaristic Neo-Assyrian Empire that would emerge after the Bronze Age collapse. Mesopotamian religion permeated every aspect of Bronze Age life in the region. The Mesopotamians worshipped a large pantheon of gods and goddesses, each associated with natural forces, cities, or aspects of life. An, the sky god, stood at the head of the pantheon. Enlil, god of wind and storm, held great power. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, aided humanity. Inanna, later called Ishtar, was goddess of love and war. Each city had its patron deity whose temple formed the city's center. The Mesopotamians believed that humans were created to serve the gods, providing them with offerings and maintaining their temples. Priests performed daily rituals offering food and drink to divine statues. Religious festivals marked the agricultural calendar, celebrating planting, harvest, and other important events. The Mesopotamians also practiced divination, seeking to understand divine will through reading omens in animal entrails, observing celestial movements, and interpreting dreams. Mesopotamian cosmology envisioned a universe created from chaos, with order imposed by the gods. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes how the god Marduk defeated the chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her body. This creation through divine combat reflected the Mesopotamian worldview, that order must constantly be maintained against forces of chaos. The king's role included maintaining cosmic order by upholding justice, performing rituals, and defeating enemies. Trade was essential to Mesopotamian civilization. The river valleys lacked many crucial resources including stone, timber, and metal ores. Mesopotamians traded agricultural surpluses, textiles, and manufactured goods for these necessary materials. Trade routes extended in all directions. Northwest to Anatolia for silver and timber, northeast to Iran for copper and lapis lazuli, east to the Indus Valley for carnelian and exotic goods, south to the Persian Gulf and beyond for pearls and precious materials, and west to Syria and the Mediterranean coast for cedar and olive oil. This extensive trade network meant that Mesopotamian influence spread far beyond the river valleys. Mesopotamian goods, dirs, and cultural practices reached distant lands. Conversely, foreign influences flowed into Mesopotamia, creating a dynamic cultural exchange. Merchants became important figures in society, some accumulating considerable wealth through long-distance trade. The development of accounting techniques, contracts, and commercial law supported increasingly sophisticated economic activity. The legacy of Bronze Age Mesopotamia extends far beyond the period itself. Mesopotamian mathematical and astronomical knowledge influenced later Greek and Islamic science. The 7-day week, base time measurements, and zodiac signs all trace back to Mesopotamia. Legal concepts from Mesopotamian law codes influenced subsequent legal traditions. Writing systems derived from cuneiform spread across Western Asia. Religious and mythological themes from Mesopotamia appear in later traditions, including biblical narratives. The very concept of civilization as we understand it owes much to the achievements of Bronze Age. Mesopotamia. Along the banks of the Nile River, one of the Bronze Age's most remarkable civilizations flourished for nearly 3 millennia. Ancient Egypt developed a distinctive culture characterized by monumental architecture, elaborate religious beliefs, sophisticated administrative systems, and remarkable stability. The Bronze Age in Egypt, spanning roughly from 3100 to 1200 years before the Common Era, witnessed the construction of the pyramids, the expansion of Egyptian power into neighbouring regions, and the creation of artistic and literary masterpieces. The geography of Egypt profoundly shaped its civilization. The Nile River flooded predictably each year, depositing fertile silt along its banks and creating a narrow ribbon of agricultural land through otherwise barren desert. This reliable flooding pattern allowed Egyptian farmers to produce abundant harvests, supporting a large population. The surrounding deserts provided natural barriers against invasion, contributing to Egypt's remarkable stability compared to the more turbulent conditions in Mesopotamia. The Nile also served as a highway, facilitating transportation and communication throughout the kingdom. The Bronze Age in Egypt began with the unification of Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north around 3100 years before the Common Era. According to tradition, a king named Nama, or Menes, accomplished this unification, establishing the first dynasty and making Memphis the capital. This marked the beginning of Egypt's early dynastic period and the Archaic or Early Bronze Age in Egyptian chronology. The unification of Egypt created one of the ancient world's first nation-states. Unlike Mesopotamia with its competing city-states, Egypt was ruled by a single king, the pharaoh, who was considered a living god. This divine kingship gave Egyptian rulers unparalleled authority and contributed to political stability. The pharaoh owned all land, theoretically, appointed officials to administer the kingdom, commanded the army, and served as chief priest performing rituals to maintain cosmic order. The Old Kingdom, lasting from approximately 2686 to 2181 years before the Common Era, represented Egypt's first golden age. This period, sometimes called the Age of Pyramids, saw the construction of the most famous monuments of ancient Egypt. The pyramid complex at Giza, built during the 4th dynasty, stands as the most iconic achievement of the Old Kingdom. The Great Pyramid, constructed for Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 years before the Common Era, originally stood 481 feet tall and consisted of approximately 2,300,000 limestone blocks. The precision of its construction astounds modern observers. The pyramid's sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, varying by only a fraction of a degree. The stone blocks fit together so tightly that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. Building the Great Pyramid required extraordinary organizational capabilities. Egyptologists estimate that the project took 20 to 30 years and involved tens of thousands of workers. Contrary to popular belief, these workers were not enslaved people, but paid labourers who worked in rotating shifts. Archaeological discoveries at workers' villages near Giza reveal that these labourers received food rations, medical care, and were buried with respect, suggesting they took pride in their work on the pharaoh's eternal resting place. The pyramids served as elaborate tombs designed to ensure the pharaoh's safe passage to the afterlife. Egyptian religion placed tremendous importance on proper burial and preservation of the body. The Egyptians believed that each person consisted of several elements, including the Ka, a life force, and the Ba, a personality that could move between the worlds of the living and dead. For the deceased to live eternally, the body had to be preserved through mummification, and the Ka needed sustenance through offerings. The pyramid protected the royal mummy and contained chambers filled with grave goods the pharaoh would need in the afterlife. The Old Kingdom pharaohs claimed absolute authority, presenting themselves as gods who maintained Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth and justice. The vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister, oversaw the administration of the kingdom. Below the vizier, a bureaucracy of officials managed provinces, collected taxes, organised labour projects and maintained records. Scribes formed a literate elite, their skills in writing hieroglyphics making them indispensable to the functioning of the state. Egyptian society during the Old Kingdom was rigidly hierarchical. The pharaoh and royal family occupied the apex. The nobility, consisting of high officials and provincial governors, controlled land and resources. Priests managed temples and performed religious rituals. Scribes and craftsmen occupied the middle levels. Farmers formed the majority of the population, working the land and paying taxes in the form of produce and labour. At the bottom stood servants and enslaved people, though slavery was less central to the Egyptian economy than to some other ancient societies. The Old Kingdom eventually declined due to a combination of factors. The construction of massive pyramids drained the treasury. Regional governors gained increasing autonomy, weakening central authority. Climate change brought reduced Nile floods and consequent famines. Around 2180 years before the Common Era, the Old Kingdom collapsed into the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation and social upheaval. The Middle Kingdom, beginning around 2050 years before the Common Era, saw Egypt reunified under the 11th dynasty. Pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom restored central authority, though they never achieved the absolute power of the Old Kingdom rulers. The capital moved from Memphis to Thebes in the south. This period saw significant developments in literature, art and architecture, though pyramids became smaller and less elaborate than their Old Kingdom predecessors. Middle Kingdom pharaohs focused on expanding Egyptian influence and securing borders. They campaigned into Nubia to the south, establishing fortresses along the Nile to control trade routes and extract gold from Nubian mines. These massive mud brick fortresses, some with walls 30 feet thick, show Egyptian military engineering capabilities. The pharaohs also maintained diplomatic and trade relations with Syrian and Anatolian states to the north, importing cedar wood, olive oil and other goods. Egyptian literature flourished during the Middle Kingdom. Works like the Tale of Sinuhe, the story of the shipwrecked sailor, and the eloquent peasant reveal sophisticated narrative techniques and explore themes of justice, identity, and the relationship between individuals and authority. Wisdom literature, including instructions attributed to various officials, provided moral and practical guidance. Mathematical and medical texts show Egyptian knowledge in these fields. All these texts were written in hieroglyphics or the cursive hieratic script on papyrus, the paper made from Nile reeds. The Middle Kingdom came to an end around 1700 years before the Common Era during the Second Intermediate Period. This period saw Egypt divided and partially ruled by the Hyksos, a Semitic people from the Levant who established control over Lower Egypt. The Hyksos introduced new military technologies to Egypt, particularly the composite bow and the horse-drawn chariot. These innovations would later be adopted by the Egyptians when they expelled the Hyksos and reunified their kingdom. The New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 years before the Common Era, represented the height of Egyptian power and prosperity. Pharaohs of the 18th, 19th and 20th dynasties expanded Egypt into an empire, conquering territories in the Levant and establishing Egyptian dominance over Nubia. This period produced some of Egypt's most famous rulers, including Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramesses II, and Ramesses III. The expulsion of the Hyksos by Ahmose I marked the beginning of the New Kingdom. Subsequent pharaohs, particularly Thutmose III, conducted extensive military campaigns in the Levant. Thutmose III, who ruled from around 1479 to 1425 years before the Common Era, led at least 17 campaigns into Syria and Palestine. His victory at the Battle of Megiddo, one of the first battles for which detailed records survive, gave Egypt control over much of the Levant. At its height, the Egyptian Empire extended from the fourth cataract of the Nile in Nubia to the Euphrates River in Syria. Maintaining this empire required a permanent military establishment. The New Kingdom Egyptian army was well organized and equipped, featuring divisions of infantry armed with spears, swords and bows, supported by chariot corps. Egyptian chariots, manned by 2 soldiers, provided mobility and shock power on the battlefield. The army included both Egyptian troops and foreign mercenaries, particularly Nubians who served as archers and light infantry. The wealth flowing into Egypt from tribute, trade and exploitation of resources in conquered territories funded magnificent construction projects. The great temples at Karnak and Luxor, dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, grew ever larger as successive pharaohs added pylons, halls, and obelisks. These temple complexes were not just religious sites, but major economic institutions, owning vast estates, employing thousands of workers, and functioning as centers of learning and culture. New Kingdom pharaohs were buried not in pyramids, but in elaborate rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings near Thebes. These tombs featured long corridors descending deep into the rock, painted with scenes and texts from funerary literature like the Book of the Dead, and terminating in burial chambers. The most famous tomb, that of Tutankhamun, was discovered largely intact in 1922, revealing the extraordinary wealth placed in royal burials even for a relatively minor pharaoh. One of the most unusual episodes of the New Kingdom was the religious revolution of Akhenaten. This pharaoh, who ruled from around 1353 to 1336 years before the Common Era, attempted to transform Egyptian religion by promoting the worship of Aten, the sun disker, above all other gods. Akhenaten built a new capital at Amarna, closed temples to other gods, and suppressed traditional religious practices. The artistic style of the Amarna period broke dramatically with Egyptian conventions, showing the royal family in intimate, almost casual scenes with exaggerated naturalistic features. Akhenaten's religious revolution did not survive his death. His successor, the young Tutankhamun, restored the traditional gods and abandoned Amarna. The priests of Amun, who had been persecuted under Akhenaten, regained their power and wealth. Later Egyptian records treated Akhenaten as a heretic, omitting him from king lists and attempting to erase his memory. However, the Amarna period left a fascinating glimpse into religious change and royal authority in ancient Egypt. The 19th dynasty saw the rise of the Ramessid pharaohs, particularly Ramesses II, who ruled for 67 years from approximately 1279 to 1213 years before the Common Era. Ramesses was a prolific builder, erecting more monuments and statues than any other pharaoh. His most famous monument, the temple at Abu Simbel, features 4 colossal statues of the seated pharaoh, each standing 67 feet tall, carved directly from the cliff face. Inside, the temple extends 185 feet into the rock, with halls supported by massive columns. Ramesses II also fought the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire around 1274 years before the Common Era. This battle, fought in Syria, was one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history, involving perhaps 10,000 chariots and 50,000 soldiers in total. Both sides claimed victory, but the battle ended in a strategic stalemate. Years later, Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed a peace treaty, one of the earliest international treaties known to history. The treaty established borders, provided for mutual defense, and included extradition provisions. The New Kingdom began to decline in the late 19th and 20th dynasties. Egypt faced increasing pressure from Libyan tribes to the west and from the Sea Peoples, mysterious invaders who disrupted the entire eastern Mediterranean around 1200 years before the Common Era. Ramesses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, defeated invasions by both Libyans and Sea Peoples, but his reign marked the end of Egypt's imperial age. Economic problems, strikes by tomb workers, political instability, and loss of territories in the Levant characterized the later 20th dynasty. Egyptian religion permeated every aspect of life and shaped Egyptian culture profoundly. The Egyptians worshipped a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses, many of whom were depicted with animal heads or bodies. Ra, the sun god, was among the most important, often merged with other deities like Amun to form Amun-Ra. Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection, presided over the afterlife. His wife Isis and son Horus were also major deities. Ptah was the creator god and patron of craftsmen. Thoth governed wisdom and writing. Hathor was goddess of love and joy. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife was elaborate and central to their worldview. The Egyptians believed that death was not an end, but a transition to another form of existence. However, reaching the afterlife successfully required proper burial, preservation of the body, and passing judgment before Osiris. In the judgment scene, depicted in the Book of the Dead, the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and justice. If the heart was heavier than the feather, meaning the person had lived an unjust life, it would be devoured by the monster Ammit, and the person would cease to exist. This belief in judgment after death influenced Egyptian ethics and behaviour. The negative confession, a list of sins the deceased claimed not to have committed, included crimes like murder and theft, but also moral failings like causing others to weep or speaking falsely. The emphasis on Ma'at encouraged ethical behaviour and provided moral guidelines for society. Mummification, developed as a response to Egyptian beliefs about bodily preservation. The process took 70 days and involved removing internal organs, which were stored in canopic jars, drying the body with natron salt, wrapping it in linen bandages, and placing it in a coffin. Wealthy Egyptians could afford elaborate mummification and richly decorated coffins and tomb equipment. Poorer Egyptians received simpler burials, but even they attempted some form of body preservation. Egyptian art followed strict conventions for thousands of years. Figures were depicted with heads in profile but eyes facing forward, torsos shown frontally and legs in profile. This composite view aimed not for realism but for showing each element in its most recognizable form. Scenes were organized in registers, horizontal bands that separated different parts of a narrative. Scale indicated importance, with pharaohs and gods and the gods shown larger than ordinary people. These conventions created a distinctive Egyptian aesthetic that remained remarkably consistent across centuries. Hieroglyphic writing used for religious texts and monumental inscriptions was one of 3 Egyptian scripts. Hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphics, was used for everyday documents. Demotic, an even more simplified script, developed later. Hieroglyphics combined logographic signs representing whole words with phonetic signs representing sounds. The same symbol could be used in different ways depending on context. This complexity meant that literacy was limited to scribes who underwent years of training. Egyptian achievements in mathematics, medicine, and engineering were impressive. Egyptian mathematicians understood geometry well enough to calculate areas and volumes, essential for surveying fields and planning construction projects. The Rhine mathematical papyrus shows that Egyptians could solve problems involving fractions, proportions, and simple algebra. Egyptian astronomers tracked the stars, developed a 365-day calendar, and could predict the Nile's annual flood. Egyptian medicine was among the most advanced in the ancient world. Medical papyri described treatments for various ailments, surgical procedures, and anatomical knowledge. Egyptian doctors specialized in different areas, with separate practitioners for eyes, teeth, and internal disorders. While Egyptian medicine mixed rational treatments with magical spells, it showed empirical observation and accumulated knowledge. Procedures like setting broken bones, treating wounds, and performing surgery demonstrated considerable skill. Trade was vital to Egyptian prosperity. Egypt exported grain, papyrus, linen, gold, and manufactured goods. In return, Egypt imported cedar from Lebanon, olive oil from the Levant, copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources, silver from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory and ebony from Nubia and Punt, and incense from Arabia. Egyptian trade expeditions travelled by sea to Punt, probably located on the Horn of Africa, returning with exotic goods. Overland caravans traversed the deserts to the Red Sea and the Levant. The legacy of Bronze Age Egypt remains visible in countless ways. Egyptian architectural and artistic styles influenced other cultures, particularly through later Greek and Roman contact with Egypt. Egyptian religious and mythological concepts, including ideas about judgment after death and resurrection, influenced later religious traditions. The Egyptian calendar contributed to the modern calendar system. The preservation of Egyptian records and monuments provides invaluable information about Bronze Age life and culture. The image of ancient Egypt with its pyramids, pharaohs, and mysterious hieroglyphics continues to capture human imagination thousands of years after the Bronze Age ended. The Bronze Age in the Aegean region produced 2 remarkable civilizations, the Minoans on the island of Crete and the Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland. These cultures, flourishing between approximately 3200 and 1100 years before the Common Era, developed distinctive societies characterized by sophisticated palace complexes, extensive maritime trade, and rich artistic traditions. The Aegean Bronze Age laid foundations for later Greek civilization and left a legacy of myths and legends that would inspire literature and art for millennia. The Minoan civilization emerged on Crete, the largest island in the Aegean Sea, around 3200 years before the Common Era. The culture is named for the legendary King Minos, though no historical figure by that name has been confirmed. Minoan civilization developed in relative isolation, shielded by the sea from the mainland conflicts that disrupted other Bronze Age societies. This security allowed the Minoans to flourish without building massive fortifications or maintaining large armies. Minoan culture centered on elaborate palace complexes, the most famous being Knossos, excavated by British archaeologist Arthur Evans in the early 20th century. The palace at Knossos covered approximately 150,000 square feet and contained hundreds of rooms organised around a central courtyard. The structure featured multiple stories, connected by staircases and corridors forming such a complex layout that it may have inspired the Greek legend of the labyrinth. The architecture of Minoan palaces showed remarkable sophistication. Buildings incorporated light wells to bring natural light into interior rooms. An advanced drainage system with terracotta pipes carried water and waste, providing sanitation ahead of its time. Storage magazines held large clay vessels called pithoi, some standing taller than a man, filled with olive oil, wine, grain, and other goods. Workshops within the palace complexes produced pottery, metalwork, and textiles. These palaces functioned as economic centres, religious sites, and administrative hubs, combining multiple roles in single complexes. Minoan art displayed a distinctive aesthetic quite different from other Bronze Age cultures. Minoan frescoes featured bright colours, graceful lines, and naturalistic subjects. Popular motifs included dolphins swimming in the sea, flowers and plants, birds, and elegant human figures engaged in various activities. One famous fresco from Knossos shows young people leaping over bulls, possibly depicting a religious ritual. The vibrant, life-affirming quality of Minoan art contrasted with the more formal and militaristic art of contemporary Near Eastern cultures. Minoan religion remains somewhat mysterious because we cannot fully read their written scripts. Shrines and religious symbols suggest that the Minoans worshipped female deities, possibly reflecting a matriarchal or egalitarian social structure. The snake goddess figurines found at various sites show women holding serpents, associated with earth and regeneration. Bull imagery appears frequently in Minoan art and architecture, suggesting the bull held religious significance. Mountain peaks, caves, and certain trees seem to have been considered sacred, with offerings left at these natural sites. The Minoans developed two writing systems, Linear A and Linear B. Linear A, the earlier script, remains undeciphered, though it appears to record the Minoan language, which was not Greek. The script consists of syllabic signs and appears on clay tablets, pottery, and other objects. Without understanding Linear A, much about Minoan administration, economy, and beliefs remains hidden. Linear B, adopted later by the Mycenaeans and successfully deciphered in the 1950s, represents an early form of Greek and provides much more information about Bronze Age Aegean civilization. Minoan civilization was fundamentally maritime. The Minoans built a powerful fleet that dominated Aegean trade. Minoan ships carried pottery, textiles, and metalwork to Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and across the Aegean islands. In return, they imported copper, tin, ivory, and luxury goods. Minoan pottery has been found throughout the eastern Mediterranean, testament to the extent of their trade networks. The Minoans may have established colonies or trading posts on various Aegean islands, extending their cultural and economic influence. Minoan society appears to have been relatively peaceful compared to contemporary civilizations. The palaces lacked the massive fortification walls found at Mycenaean sites. Minoan art rarely depicts warfare or combat. This has led scholars to suggest that the Minoans maintained their security through naval power, controlling the seas while leaving their cities unfortified. Whether this reflects actual pacifism or simply confidence in their fleet remains debate. Around 1700 years before the Common Era, disaster struck Minoan civilization. A massive volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, about 70 miles north of Crete, devastated the region. The eruption was one of the largest in recorded history, perhaps 10 times more powerful than the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii. The explosion destroyed Thera itself, burying the Minoan settlement of Akrotiri under volcanic ash. Tsunamis generated by the eruption would have struck Crete's northern coast, possibly damaging coastal settlements and the Minoan fleet. The exact impact of the Thera eruption on Minoan civilization remains debated. Some scholars argue it caused immediate collapse, while others suggest the Minoans recovered but were weakened, making them vulnerable to conquest by the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. The archaeological evidence shows that while some sites were destroyed or abandoned, others, including Knossos, continued to function. However, around 1500 years before the Common Era, Knossos and other Cretan sites show evidence of Mycenaean presence, with Linear B tablets appearing alongside or replacing Linear A. This suggests that Mycenaeans gained control over Crete, marking the end of independent Minoan civilization. The Mycenaean civilization developed on the Greek mainland, with major centres at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Athens, and Thebes. The Mycenaeans were Greek speakers, the ancestors of classical Greeks, and their culture had a much more martial character than the Minoans. Mycenaean civilization reached its height between 1600 and 1200 years before the Common Era, an era later remembered in Greek legends about heroes, kings, and the Trojan War. Mycenaean citadels were heavily fortified, built on hilltops and surrounded by massive stone walls. The walls at Mycenaean Tiryns used Cyclopean masonry, employing boulders so large that later Greeks believed they must have been built by the Cyclopes, the mythical race of giants. Some stones in these walls weigh many tons. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, featuring 2 lionesses flanking a column carved in relief, served as the main entrance to the citadel, and remains an iconic image of Bronze Age Greece. Inside these fortifications, Mycenaean rulers built palace complexes, centred on megaron halls. The megaron, featuring a large rectangular hall with a central hearth and 4 columns supporting the roof, served as the throne room and ceremonial centre. The megaron's design would influence later Greek temple architecture. Walls were decorated with frescoes similar to Minoan examples, but often depicting warfare, hunting, and other vigorous activities reflecting Mycenaean warrior culture. Mycenaean society was hierarchical and militaristic. A king, called Wanax in Linear B texts, ruled each kingdom. Below him stood the Lauagetus, possibly a military commander. A noble class of warriors, called basileas, controlled land and resources. Scribes managed palace administration, keeping detailed records on Linear B tablets. Craftsmen produced weapons, pottery, and luxury goods. Farmers and herders worked the land. At the bottom stood enslaved people called doroi, who performed heavy labour. The decipherment of Linear B by Michael Ventris in 1952 revealed much about Mycenaean society. The tablets, found at Pylos, Mycenae, Thebes, and Knossos, record economic transactions, inventories, personnel assignments, and religious offerings. They show a highly bureaucratic society where the palace tracked everything from military equipment to perfumed oils to textile production. The tablets list occupations including bronzesmiths, goldsmiths, bowmakers, chairmakers, fullers, spinners, and many others, indicating economic specialization. Warfare played a central role in Mycenaean culture. Linear B tablets list military equipment including chariots, horses, wheels, armor, and weapons. Mycenaean warriors wore bronze armor, including breastplates and helmets, some featuring boar's tusk decorations. They fought with bronze swords, spears, and large figure-of-8 or tower shields. Chariots drawn by 2 horses provided elite warriors with mobility and prestige. Mycenaean warfare combined chariot-born aristocrats with infantry forces. The Mycenaeans were aggressive expansionists. They gained control over Crete around 1500 years before the Common Era, establishing themselves at Knossos and other Cretan sites. Mycenaean pottery and goods appear throughout the Aegean, southern Italy, Sicily, Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt, showing their extensive trade and possible colonization. Mycenaean traders and warriors ranged widely across the eastern Mediterranean, spreading Greek culture and establishing contacts with other Bronze Age civilizations. The question of whether the Trojan War actually occurred has fascinated scholars for centuries. The Trojan War, immortalized in Homer's Iliad, tells of a Greek coalition led by King Agamemnon of Mycenae besieging the city of Troy to recover Helen, who had been taken by the Trojan prince Paris. Archaeological excavations at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey have revealed multiple layers of occupation, with Troy 7, showing evidence of destruction around 1200 to 1180 years before the Common Era. Roughly the time tradition dates the Trojan War. While no definitive proof exists that Homer's Trojan War occurred exactly as described, the story may preserve memories of Mycenaean raids or expeditions to Anatolia. The catalogue of ships in the Iliad lists Mycenaean kingdoms and their military contributions, potentially reflecting actual political geography of the Bronze Age. The detailed descriptions of armour, weapons, and burial customs in the Iliad match archaeological findings from Mycenaean sites. Whether the Trojan War happened as Homer described or not, the legends reflect real Bronze Age Greek culture and preserve memories of the Mycenaean age. Mycenaean religion centered on deities who would later become familiar Greek gods. Linear B tablets mention Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Hermes, Athena, Artemis, and Dionysus, among others. Religious practices included animal sacrifices, offerings of agricultural produce, and dedications of valuable objects. Shrines existed within palaces and in natural settings like caves and mountaintops. The Mycenaeans also practiced elaborate burial rituals, with wealthy individuals interred in tholos tombs, circular burial chambers built into hillsides and covered with earth mounds. The tholos tomb at Mycenae, called the Treasury of Atreus, represents the height of Mycenaean architecture. Built around 1300 years before the Common Era, the tomb features a massive stone doorway leading to a circular chamber 39 feet in diameter and 43 feet high. The dome was constructed using corbelling, with each successive ring of stones projecting inward until meeting at the top. The engineering precision required to construct this tomb without collapse demonstrates sophisticated architectural knowledge. Mycenaean art included pottery decorated with stylized marine creatures, abstract patterns, and later military scenes. Mycenaean goldsmiths produced extraordinary jewellery and decorative objects, including the famous gold death masks found in shaft graves at Mycenae. These masks, placed over the faces of the deceased, show remarkable craftsmanship in repoussé work, where the gold was hammered from the reverse side to create relief decorations. Mycenaean craftsmen also produced carved ivory objects, inlaid weapons, and finely worked bronze vessels. The Mycenaean civilization came to a violent end around 1200 to 1100 years before the Common Era. Citadels across Greece show evidence of destruction by fire. Pylos was completely destroyed and never rebuilt. Mycenae, Tiryns, and other sites suffered damage, though some recovered partially. The palace system collapsed, Linear B writing disappeared, and Greece entered a dark age lasting several centuries. The causes of this collapse remain debated, but were likely connected to the broader Bronze Age collapse affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean. In the highlands of Anatolia, modern Turkey, the Hittite Empire emerged as one of the Bronze Age's great powers. From approximately 1700 to 1200 years before the Common Era, the Hittites built an empire that rivaled Egypt and the great kingdoms of Mesopotamia. The Hittites were masters of diplomacy, pioneers in iron technology, and skilled warriors whose influence extended across Anatolia and into the Levant. Their civilization left a legacy of legal codes, diplomatic treaties, and religious texts that provide invaluable insights into Bronze Age society. The Hittites were Indo-European speakers who migrated into Anatolia during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The name Hittite comes from the biblical Hittim and the Egyptian Kheta, but they called themselves the people of Hatti, adopting the name from an earlier non-Indo-European population. The Hittite language, written in cuneiform script adapted from Mesopotamian writing, was the first Indo-European language to be written down, making Hittite texts invaluable for understanding Indo-European linguistic history. The Old Hittite Kingdom emerged around 1700 years before the Common Era, when King Hattusili I unified various Anatolian principalities under his rule. Hattusili expanded Hittite power through military campaigns into Syria, attacking the city of Aleppo and threatening Babylonian interests in the region. His successor Mursili I accomplished an extraordinary feat by sacking Babylon itself around 1595 years before the Common Era, ending the dynasty of Hammurabi. However, this ambitious campaign left the Hittite heartland vulnerable, and Mursili was assassinated shortly after his return, plunging the kingdom into internal strife. The Hittite capital at Hattusa, located near modern Boğazkale in north-central Turkey, was a formidable stronghold. The city covered 400 acres and was surrounded by massive stone walls reinforced with towers. These walls, in some sections over 20 feet thick, featured distinctive corbelled gates, including the famous Lion Gate, where 2 lions carved in relief flanked the entrance. Inside the walls stood the royal palace, numerous temples, administrative buildings, and residential areas. The site's rugged terrain meant that the city spread across several hills and ridges, creating a complex urban landscape. One of Hattusa's most remarkable features was its royal archives, discovered in the early 20th century. These archives contained thousands of clay tablets written in Hittite cuneiform, but also in Akkadian, Hurrian, and other languages. The tablets include historical annals, religious texts, myths, prayers, legal documents, diplomatic correspondence, and treaties. This multilingual archive revealed the cosmopolitan nature of the Hittite state and provided crucial information about Bronze Age international relations. After the turmoil following Mursili's death, the Hittite state eventually stabilized and entered its imperial phase during the New Kingdom period, beginning around 1400 years before the Common Era. King Tudhaliya I and his successors Anuwanda I and Tudhaliya II expanded Hittite control and consolidated royal authority. However, the empire reached its zenith under Suppiluliuma I, who ruled from approximately 1380 to 1322 years before the Common Era. Suppiluliuma transformed the Hittite state into a true empire through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic skill. He campaigned extensively in Syria, defeating the Mitanni kingdom and bringing much of Syria under Hittite control. When the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun died, his widow allegedly sent a letter to Suppiluliuma asking for one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh of Egypt. Suppiluliuma sent his son Zananza, but the prince was murdered en route to Egypt, possibly by Egyptian officials opposed to the match. This incident demonstrates the high-stakes diplomacy of the Bronze Age and the interconnections between great powers. The Hittites excelled in diplomacy and international law. Hittite kings negotiated numerous treaties with neighbouring states, establishing spheres of influence and mutual obligations. These treaties followed a consistent format, beginning with a historical prologue describing relations between the parties, followed by specific stipulations, provisions for document storage and public reading, lists of divine witnesses, and curses and blessings. This treaty format would influence later Near Eastern and eventually biblical covenant formulations. The most famous Hittite treaty was negotiated between Hittite king Hattusili III and Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II around 1259 years before the Common Era, following the inconclusive Battle of Kadesh. This treaty established peace between the two empires, defined borders, provided for mutual defence against third parties, and included extradition clauses for fugitives. Copies of the treaty exist in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, representing one of the earliest bilingual international agreements. A copy of this treaty hangs in the United Nations building in New York as a symbol of diplomatic achievement. Hittite military organisation was sophisticated and effective. The Hittite army combined infantry and chariot forces, with the three-man Hittite chariot distinguishing them from other Bronze Age powers who typically used two-man chariots. The additional crewman, likely a shield-bearer, provided extra protection for the charioteer and warrior. Hittite infantry fought with spears, swords and axes, protected by shields and sometimes armour. The Hittites also employed siege warfare techniques using ramps, battering rams, and mining to capture fortified cities. The Hittites are often credited with pioneering iron technology, though this claim requires nuance. Iron was known and used sporadically during the Bronze Age, but true ironworking involving carburization to create steel developed gradually. The Hittites certainly worked iron and may have guarded ironworking knowledge, treating iron as a precious material. Some scholars argue that Hittite control of iron sources gave them military advantages. However, widespread iron use only developed after the Bronze Age collapse, during the subsequent Iron Age. Nevertheless, Hittite experience with iron may have contributed to its eventual spread. Hittite society was hierarchical but showed some unusual features. The Hittite king held supreme political and military authority and served as high priest, but royal power was somewhat constrained by the nobility and by traditional law. The Pancus, an assembly of nobles, had some advisory and judicial functions, limiting absolute royal authority. Women held higher status in Hittite society than in many contemporary cultures. The Tawananna, the queen or queen mother, wielded significant religious and political influence. Hittite law codes suggest more gender equality than surrounding societies, with women able to own property and engage in business. Hittite law, preserved in cuneiform tablets, represents one of the earliest surviving legal codes. Unlike the harsh retributive justice of Hammurabi's code with its principle of exact retaliation, Hittite law often prescribed compensation for injuries rather than punishment. For example, rather than executing someone who caused another's death, Hittite law might require the perpetrator to provide replacement workers to the victim's family. This pragmatic approach focused on restoring balance and compensating loss rather than exacting vengeance. The code covered property rights, marriage, inheritance, criminal offences, and agricultural regulations, providing detailed insight into Hittite daily life. Religion permeated Hittite culture, with the Hittites worshipping a vast pantheon, drawn from multiple cultural traditions. The storm god Tarhunt was among the most important deities, reflecting the agricultural basis of Hittite society and the importance of rainfall. The sun goddess Arinna held high status as patron of the Hittite state. The Hittites also adopted deities from the Hurrians, including Shaushka, a goddess of war and love, and Tishub and Habkushub, another storm god. This religious syncretism, combining gods from different traditions, characterized Hittite religious practice. Hittite religious texts include myths, prayers, hymns, and ritual instructions. One important myth cycle concerns the storm god's conflict with the dragon Ilyanka, a creation myth explaining cosmic order's establishment through divine combat. The myth of the disappearing god Telepinu describes how the god's anger and departure caused crop failures and disasters until he was found and appeased, explaining agricultural cycles. These myths show connections to both Mesopotamian and later Greek mythology, suggesting cultural transmission across the Bronze Age world. Hittite rock reliefs at Yazilikaya near Hattusa depict a procession of deities carved into the living rock. The main gallery shows more than 60 gods and goddesses marching in two processions that meet at the centre, dominated by the storm god and sun goddess. This open-air sanctuary served religious functions and demonstrates Hittite artistic achievement. The reliefs, dating to the 13th century before the Common Era, represent one of the most important surviving examples of Hittite art. The Hittite Empire faced increasing pressures in the 13th century before the Common Era. Assyria grew more powerful, competing for control of Syria. Egypt remained a rival despite the peace treaty. Internal instability plagued the dynasty, most seriously migrations and invasions by various groups, including some of the mysterious sea peoples threatened Hittite territories. The last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, ruled around 1127, 2 years before the Common Era, but the exact end date of his reign and the empire remains uncertain. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, Hattusa was destroyed and abandoned. The Hittite Empire collapsed as part of the broader Bronze Age collapse affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean. However, Hittite culture did not completely disappear. Neo-Hittite city-states emerged in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, preserving Hittite cultural traditions for several more centuries. These states used hieroglyphic Luwian, related to Hittite, and maintained artistic and cultural connections to the Hittite past. Eventually, these Neo-Hittite states were conquered by Assyria in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. The rediscovery of the Hittite civilization in modern times represents one of archaeology's great achievements. The Hittites were known from biblical and Egyptian references, but were considered a minor people, until excavations at Hattusa and Alakahuyuk revealed their true importance. The decipherment of Hittite cuneiform by Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný in 1915 opened Hittite texts to scholarly study. This work revealed the Hittites as a major Bronze Age power whose empire had been largely forgotten, until modern archaeology recovered their history. The Bronze Age witnessed the development of extensive trade networks connecting distant regions in unprecedented ways. These commercial connections transformed Bronze Age societies, creating economic interdependence, facilitating cultural exchange, and contributing to the cosmopolitan character of the Bronze Age world. Understanding these trade networks is essential to grasping how Bronze Age civilizations functioned and interacted. The fundamental driver of Bronze Age trade was the uneven distribution of essential resources. Bronze production required both copper and tin, but these metals rarely occurred together naturally. Copper deposits existed in Cyprus, Anatolia, the Sinai Peninsula, Iran, and various other locations. Tin, however, was much rarer, with major sources in Cornwall in southwestern Britain, the Erzgebirge mountains between modern Germany and Czech Republic, and eastern regions including Afghanistan. This meant that virtually every Bronze Age civilization needed to trade to obtain both metals necessary for bronze production. The tin trade was particularly important and complex. Tin from Afghanistan travelled westward along routes through Iran to Mesopotamia and beyond. Tin from Cornwall reached the Mediterranean through overland routes across France or by sea around the Iberian Peninsula. Central European tin moved along river valleys like the Danube to reach various markets. The long distances involved in tin trading meant that control of trade routes provided significant economic and political advantages. Kingdoms positioned along trade routes could tax passing merchants, directly participate in trade, or control access to the crucial resources. Maritime trade flourished during the Bronze Age, particularly in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean regions. Ships carried bulk goods including grain, wine, olive oil, and timber, as well as luxury items like precious metals, ivory, and fine textiles. Shipwrecks discovered by underwater archaeologists provide direct evidence of Bronze Age maritime commerce. The Uluburun shipwreck, found off the coast of Turkey and dating to around 1300 years before the Common Era, carried a cargo worth a fortune including 10 tons of copper, 1 ton of tin, glass ingots, ivory, ebony, ostrich eggs, jewellery and pottery from multiple sources. The ship's cargo originated from at least 7 different cultures, demonstrating the interconnected nature of Bronze Age trade. Another significant shipwreck, discovered off Point Iria in Greece and dating to around 1500 years before the Common Era, contained copper ingots, pottery and luxury goods. The Cape Gelidonia shipwreck off Turkey's coast held similar materials. These shipwrecks show that Bronze Age merchants engaged in tramping trade, moving from port to port, buying and selling various goods rather than following fixed routes with predetermined cargoes. This flexible trading system allowed merchants to respond to market conditions and maximize profits. The shape and marking of copper ingots provide fascinating insights into Bronze Age trade practices. Most copper was traded in the form of oxhide ingots, so called because their shape with 4 protruding handles resembled a stretched animal hide. These ingots typically weighed 60 to 70 pounds, a standardized size convenient for transportation and trading. Many ingots bore marks or signs, possibly indicating quality, origin, or ownership. The widespread distribution of similarly shaped ingots across the Mediterranean suggests common trading practices and accepted standards. Overland trade routes were equally important, though they left fewer direct archaeological traces than shipwrecks. Caravans of donkeys or camels transported goods along established routes, connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia, Iran, Central Asia and the Indus Valley. These routes followed water sources, passed through mountain passes, and connected oases in desert regions. Merchants travelling these routes faced dangers including bandits, harsh weather and political instability, but the potential profits made the risks worthwhile. The Royal Road in the Near East, though more famous from the later Persian period, had Bronze Age predecessors. Routes connected Mesopotamian cities with Anatolia, facilitating trade in tin, textiles and other goods. Assyrian merchant colonies in Anatolia, particularly at Kanesh, modern Kultepe, operated during the Old Assyrian period around 1900 to 1700 years before the Common Era. Cuneiform tablets from Kanesh document commercial transactions showing Assyrian merchants traded Mesopotamian textiles and tin for Anatolian silver and gold. These merchants lived in separate commercial quarters outside Anatolian cities, maintaining their own administrative and religious institutions. The Indus Valley civilization engaged in extensive maritime trade with Mesopotamia through the Persian Gulf. Sumerian texts mention Meluhha, generally identified with the Indus civilization, as a source of exotic goods including carnelian beads, ivory and possibly timber. Dilmun, identified with Bahrain and Magan, possibly Oman, served as intermediary trading centres. Archaeological discoveries of Indus seals in Mesopotamia and Mesopotamian artefacts in Indus sites confirm active commercial relationships. Ships likely followed coastal routes, taking advantage of seasonal winds and staying within sight of land when possible. Trade in luxury goods was particularly important for Bronze Age elites. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan's Badakhshan region was used across the ancient world for its deep blue colour. This semi-precious stone travelled thousands of miles to appear in Mesopotamian temples, Egyptian jewellery and Aegean palaces. Amber from the Baltic region reached the Mediterranean, prized for its golden colour and supposed magical properties. Ivory from African and Syrian elephants was carved into decorative objects and inlays. These luxury goods served as status symbols, demonstrating the owner's wealth and connections to distant lands. Certain goods had particular cultural or religious significance beyond their material value. Incense including frankincense and myrrh came from southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, used in religious rituals across the ancient world. Cedar wood from Lebanon was highly valued for construction, particularly in Egypt where trees were scarce. The Bible later records Solomon importing Lebanese cedar for his temple, continuing a tradition established during the Bronze Age. Purple dye extracted from murex sea snails along the Phoenician coast was incredibly valuable, requiring thousands of snails to produce small amounts of dye. This royal purple became a symbol of power and prestige. Bronze Age trade was not merely economic, but facilitated cultural exchange and technological diffusion. When merchants travelled between civilizations, they carried not just goods but also ideas, techniques and beliefs. Artistic motifs spread along trade routes, with designs from one culture appearing in another's artwork. Writing systems influenced one another, with cuneiform adopted and adapted by non-Mesopotamian peoples. Religious concepts and mythological themes showed cross-cultural similarities, possibly transmitted through commercial contacts. The spread of bronze working technology itself demonstrates cultural transmission through trade networks. Metallurgical knowledge moved from early centres in the Near East to Europe, Central Asia, and eventually East Asia. The techniques of mining, smelting, alloying, and casting spread gradually, with local innovations and adaptations emerging in different regions. The movement of finished bronze objects also introduced peoples to the advantages of bronze technology, creating demand and eventually local production. Food crops and domesticated animals also travelled along Bronze Age trade routes. Wheat and barley, originally domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, spread to Europe, North Africa, and South Asia. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs moved similarly. The horse, domesticated on the Eurasian steppes, reached the Near East and transformed warfare with the invention of chariots. These biological exchanges, often called the Bronze Age equivalent of the Columbian Exchange, fundamentally altered agricultural systems and diets across vast regions. The economic integration of the Bronze Age world created vulnerabilities as well as opportunities. Societies became dependent on imported materials, particularly tin for bronze production. Disruption of trade routes could cause serious economic problems. A kingdom cut off from tin supplies would struggle to equip its army with bronze weapons or produce bronze tools for agriculture. This interdependence meant that instability in one region could cascade through the entire system, affecting distant areas. This vulnerability would become apparent during the Bronze Age collapse. Bronze Age states developed various mechanisms to manage and control trade. Some established royal monopolies on certain goods, with the palace controlling imports and exports. Treaties between kingdoms often included trade provisions, establishing merchant rights and resolving commercial disputes. Diplomatic gifts between rulers could be substantial, blurring the line between gift exchange and trade. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and Near Eastern kingdoms from the 14th century before the Common Era, frequently mention gifts including gold, horses, chariots, and luxury objects. Merchant communities in Bronze Age cities formed a distinct social class. These traders accumulated wealth through commerce, though their social status varied across different cultures. In some societies, merchants were respected and influential. In others, they held lower status than landowners and warriors despite their wealth. Merchants required literacy and numeracy to keep accounts and conduct business, contributing to the literate elite of Bronze Age societies. Some merchant families maintained commercial operations across generations, building networks and expertise passed from father to son. The physical infrastructure supporting Bronze Age trade included harbours, warehouses, roads, and caravanserais. Ports developed facilities for loading and unloading ships, storing goods and conducting transactions. Some became cosmopolitan entrepôts where merchants from multiple cultures met and traded. Ugarit in Syria was such a port, with texts in multiple languages and evidence of merchants from Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, and elsewhere. The city served as a hub where various trade routes converged, facilitating exchanges between Mediterranean and Near Eastern commercial networks. Weights and measures standardized across trading partners facilitated commerce. The discovery of similar weight systems in sites separated by thousands of miles suggests commercial conventions that transcended political boundaries. Standard units of volume for grain, wine, and oil allowed merchants to conduct transactions confidently. The development of accounting techniques, recorded on clay tablets or papyrus, tracked complex transactions involving multiple parties and goods. Double-entry bookkeeping was still far in the future, but Bronze Age merchants developed systematic methods for recording business dealings. Bronze Age trade also involved human trafficking, with enslaved people bought and sold as commodities. Warfare provided captives who became enslaved, and some were subsequently sold to other regions. Debt slavery was common, with individuals unable to repay loans becoming property of their creditors. While horrifying to modern sensibilities, slavery was a fundamental economic institution in Bronze Age societies. Enslaved people worked in agriculture, construction, domestic service, and sometimes skilled crafts. The scale of the slave trade and the conditions of enslaved people varied across different cultures and time periods. The evidence for Bronze Age trade comes from multiple sources. Archaeological discoveries of foreign objects provide direct proof of trade connections. A Mycenaean sword in a Hittite context or Minoan pottery in Egypt demonstrates contact between these civilizations. Shipwrecks offer snapshots of commercial cargoes and trading practices. Written records, including merchant letters, contracts, accounts, and diplomatic correspondence, document trade in detail. Art depicting ships, caravans, and foreign goods provides additional information. Chemical analysis of materials can identify their origins, tracing the movement of metals, stones, and other substances. The interconnected Bronze Age world represented an early form of globalization, with civilizations linked through commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. This integration brought prosperity and cultural flowering, but also created systemic vulnerabilities. When the system began to fail during the Bronze Age collapse, the consequences rippled across the entire Bronze Age world. Understanding these trade networks is essential to understanding both the achievements and the ultimate vulnerability of Bronze Age civilizations. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the Bronze Age world experienced a catastrophic collapse. Within a span of perhaps 50 to 100 years, many of the great civilizations that had flourished for centuries were destroyed or severely disrupted. Palaces burned, cities were abandoned, writing systems disappeared, trade networks collapsed, and populations declined dramatically. This period, sometimes called the Late Bronze Age collapse, represents one of history's great mysteries and one of its most dramatic examples of systemic failure. The collapse manifested differently across various regions, but shared common elements of destruction and disruption. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean palace civilization came to a violent end. Major citadels including Pylos, Thebes, and Glar were destroyed by fire. Mycenae and Tiryns suffered damage, though they partially recovered. Smaller settlements were abandoned throughout Greece. The palace administrative system collapsed, and Linear B, writing, disappeared. Greece entered a dark age lasting several centuries, with dramatically reduced population, loss of advanced crafts, and cessation of monumental building. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia for centuries, collapsed completely. The capital Hattusa was destroyed and abandoned around 1180 years before the Common Era. Hittite cuneiform writing ceased. The empire fragmented, with smaller Neo-Hittite states eventually emerging in southeastern Anatolia and Syria. But the great power that had rivaled Egypt was gone. Other Anatolian cities, including Troy, experienced destructions, though dating these precisely remains challenging. In the Levant, the situation was chaotic. Major cities including Ugarit, Megiddo, Lachish, and Hazor were destroyed. Ugarit, the prosperous port city that had been a major trading hub, was burned and never reoccupied. A letter found at Ugarit, one of the last documents before the city's destruction, speaks urgently of enemy ships sighted offshore and troops needed for defence. The destruction was so complete and the recovery so limited that the region entered a period of reduced urbanisation and cultural simplification. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse better than many civilizations, but still suffered significant disruption. Ramesses III, who ruled from approximately 1186 to 1155 years before the Common Era, fought off invasions by Libyans and the mysterious Sea Peoples. Temple reliefs at Medinet Habu depict these battles, showing land and naval combat against foreign invaders. While Egypt repelled these invasions, the effort exhausted the kingdom. The new kingdom declined rapidly after Ramesses III, with Egypt losing its territories in the Levant and entering a period of internal instability and reduced power. Mesopotamia experienced less catastrophic collapse than the Eastern Mediterranean, but still faced disruptions. Assyria suffered territory losses and economic problems, but survived and would eventually recover to build the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Babylonia went through a period of instability with the Kassite dynasty ending and various peoples, including Arameans and Chaldeans, moving into the region. The highly centralized palace economies of the Bronze Age gave way to more decentralized political and economic structures. One of the collapse's most enduring mysteries involves the Sea Peoples, groups of raiders and migrants whose attacks coincided with the collapse. Egyptian texts mention various groups including Pelasset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshish. These names possibly correspond to later Philistines, Sicilians, and other Mediterranean peoples, but identifications remain uncertain. The Sea Peoples attacked by sea and land destroying cities and kingdoms. Their origins and motivations remain debated, with theories suggesting they came from the Aegean, Anatolia, or elsewhere in the Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples were not a single unified group, but rather multiple populations possibly displaced by the collapse itself. Some may have been refugees from the Mycenaean collapse, others might have been raiders taking advantage of weakened states. Some eventually settled in the Levant, with the Philistines establishing cities along the Palestinian coast. Their attacks contributed to the collapse, but were likely as much symptom as cause, part of a broader pattern of migration and disruption. Climate change represents another factor in the Bronze Age collapse. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests a period of drought and cooling in the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 years before the Common Era. Tree ring data from Anatolia shows reduced growth, indicating less rainfall. Pollen cores from lakes suggest drier conditions. This climate deterioration would have reduced agricultural yields, causing food shortages and potentially famine. Hungry populations might have migrated in search of resources, contributing to the migrations and invasions of the period. Drought would have been particularly devastating for Bronze Age economies based on agriculture. The Great Palace civilizations required agricultural surpluses to feed urban populations and support specialized workers. Sustained drought would undermine this economic foundation. Texts from Ugarit and the Hittite kingdom mention grain shipments and requests for food, possibly indicating supply problems. Egypt, with its more reliable Nile flooding, may have been less affected by drought, helping explain its better survival. Earthquakes represent another proposed factor. The eastern Mediterranean is seismically active, and evidence suggests earthquake activity around the time of the collapse. At some sites, destructions show characteristics of earthquake damage, including collapsed walls and fallen columns. A series of earthquakes striking over several decades could have damaged cities, disrupted agriculture through destroyed irrigation systems, and created crisis conditions. However, distinguishing earthquake damage from combat damage in the archaeological record can be challenging. Systemic factors made the Bronze Age world vulnerable to collapse. The interconnected nature of Bronze Age civilization, discussed earlier as a source of strength, became a vulnerability. The complex web of trade and diplomatic relationships meant that problems in one area could cascade through the system. Disruption of tin trade would affect bronze production across multiple kingdoms. The collapse of one major power could destabilize its trading partners and allies. The system's complexity and interdependence meant it could fail catastrophically. The palatinate-centered economies of many Bronze Age states created brittle systems vulnerable to disruption. These economies concentrated resources and administrative control in royal palaces. The palace organized agricultural production, managed craft production, controlled trade, and redistributed goods. If the palace system failed through military defeat, political instability, or economic crisis, the entire economy could collapse. Alternative economic structures existed, particularly in Mesopotamia, but palace-centered economies dominated in the Aegean and Anatolia. Some scholars emphasize internal factors, including social tensions and revolts. Bronze Age societies were hierarchical, with large gaps between rulers and ruled. Heavy taxation or conscription demands might have sparked rebellions. At some sites, evidence suggests destruction from within rather than external attack. Pylos, for example, shows signs of fighting but no evidence of foreign attack. Internal collapse and civil strife may have contributed to or resulted from the broader crisis. Population movements during the period created chain reactions. When one population moved due to climate stress or other pressures, they displaced others, creating waves of migration. These movements disrupted existing political and economic structures. Some migrants became raiders when desperate for resources. Others settled forcibly in new territories, displacing existing populations. The scale of these movements is suggested by the appearance of new cultures and peoples in various regions after the collapse. The Bronze Age collapse was not instantaneous but unfolded over several decades. Different regions experienced crisis at different times, though with significant chronological overlap. The process likely accelerated once it began, with each collapse contributing to subsequent ones. A kingdom's fall would disrupt trade routes, affecting distant partners. Refugees from destroyed cities would strain resources in neighbouring regions. Military pressure on one state might be transferred to another as attackers sought new targets. The collapse was not total or uniform. Some regions suffered complete civilizational collapse, while others experienced severe disruption but continuity. Mesopotamian cities, though affected, generally survived. Cyprus experienced disruptions but recovered. Some areas, including inland Syria and Palestine, saw less dramatic change. The variability suggests that local factors, including geographic location, economic structure, and political organization, influenced how different societies experienced the crisis. The aftermath of the collapse varied greatly. In Greece, the Mycenaean palace civilization disappeared, and the region entered a dark age with reduced population, loss of literacy, and simplified material culture. However, this period eventually gave way to the Archaic period and the emergence of classical Greek civilization. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire never reconstituted, but successor states emerged. In the Levant, new peoples including Phoenicians, Israelites, and Ramesses eventually filled the power vacuum left by collapsed Bronze Age kingdoms. The collapse marked the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. With trade disrupted and tin supplies uncertain, bronze became harder to obtain. Iron, though more difficult to work, was more widely available since iron ore was much more common than tin. The development of carburization techniques that could produce steel from iron made iron weapons and tools viable alternatives to bronze. Over several centuries, iron gradually replaced bronze as the primary metal for tools and weapons. Some scholars view the Bronze Age collapse as a catastrophe that destroyed advanced civilizations and ushered in a dark age. Others emphasize continuities and see the period as a transformation rather than pure destruction. New forms of political and economic organization emerged from the collapse. Smaller states replaced large empires. Alphabetic writing systems developed, making literacy more accessible. Maritime trade eventually recovered and expanded, with Phoenician merchants sailing throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The Bronze Age collapse serves as a historical example of how complex civilizations can fail. Modern scholars draw lessons about systemic vulnerability, the dangers of over-specialization, and the cascading effects of crisis. The collapse reminds us that even sophisticated civilizations with impressive achievements can prove fragile when faced with multiple simultaneous stresses. The combination of climate change, migrations, warfare, economic disruption, and political instability overwhelmed Bronze Age resilience and adaptation capabilities. Understanding the Bronze Age collapse requires recognizing that no single cause explains such a complex event. Multiple factors, including climate change, sea peoples invasions, earthquakes, systemic economic vulnerabilities, internal revolts, and cascade effects combined to create a perfect storm that overwhelmed Bronze Age civilizations. Different factors were more important in different regions, and the precise interplay of causes remains debated. What is clear is that the prosperous, interconnected Bronze Age world of 1300 years before the Common Era had largely disappeared by 1100 years before the Common Era. The collapse also demonstrates that civilizations are not inevitable or permanent. The Bronze Age kingdom seemed powerful and permanent to their inhabitants, yet they vanished in a relatively short period. However, the collapse was not the end of civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. New civilizations emerged, building on Bronze Age foundations while developing new forms of organization. The Phoenicians developed extensive maritime trade networks. The Israelites created a monotheistic tradition. The Greeks would eventually produce philosophy, democracy, and classical culture. The Iron Age kingdoms of Assyria and Babylonia would build new empires. In this sense, the Bronze Age collapse was simultaneously an ending and a beginning. The Bronze Age represents a foundational period in human history. For approximately 2,000 years, from roughly 3,300 to 1,200 years before the Common Era, bronze technology enabled the development of complex civilizations across the ancient world. These societies created the first cities, developed writing, established empires, built monumental architecture, and forged trade networks spanning continents. The Bronze Age laid foundations that subsequent civilizations would build upon for millennia. The period witnessed extraordinary human achievement. Egyptian pyramid builders demonstrated engineering capabilities that astound modern observers. Mesopotamian scribes developed cuneiform writing and mathematics. Minoan artists created vibrant frescoes celebrating life and nature. Mycenaean warriors became the heroes of epic poetry that would be recited for thousands of years. Hittite diplomats negotiated sophisticated treaties establishing international law principles. Indian Valley urban planners designed cities with advanced sanitation systems. Chinese bronze workers created ritual vessels of unparalleled artistry. These achievements across multiple civilizations demonstrated humanity's creative and organizational capacities. Bronze itself transformed human capabilities. The alloy's hardness and workability revolutionized tools and weapons. Bronze axes cleared forests for agriculture. Bronze plows broke tough soils. Bronze sickles harvested crops efficiently. Bronze weapons gave military advantages to those who possessed them. Bronze enabled craft specialization and artistic achievement. The search for copper and tin drove trade and exploration. Bronze was simultaneously a practical material and a status symbol, a tool of production and an object of wealth. The rise of civilization during the Bronze Age fundamentally altered human society. City life brought thousands of people together in dense settlements. Specialization of labor freed individuals from subsistence farming to become craftsmen, priests, scribes, merchants, and administrators. Social hierarchies became more pronounced with rulers, nobles, priests, artisans, farmers, and enslaved people occupying different levels of society. Political. Organization evolved from village councils to territorial kingdoms to multi-ethnic empires. The Bronze Age saw the emergence of the state as we understand it, with centralized administration, taxation, legal code, and military forces. Writing systems developed during the Bronze Age transformed human culture. The ability to record information externally rather than relying solely on memory allowed for the accumulation and transmission of knowledge across generations. Economic transactions could be tracked precisely. Laws could be codified and preserved. Historical events could be documented. Religious texts could be standardized. Literature could be composed and copied. Writing created a literate elite and facilitated the development of complex administration. The Bronze Age writing systems, including cuneiform, hieroglyphics, and Linear B, were ancestors of modern writing systems that remain essential to contemporary life. The interconnected nature of the Bronze Age world foreshadowed later patterns of globalization. Trade routes connected Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley, Egypt with the Aegean, Anatolia with Afghanistan. Merchants carried goods across thousands of miles. Ideas, technologies, and cultural practices spread along these routes. The Bronze Age demonstrated that civilizations do not develop in isolation, but through contact and exchange with others. This interconnection brought prosperity and cultural flowering, but also created vulnerabilities that contributed to the Bronze Age collapse. Religion during the Bronze Age shows both diversity and common themes. Each civilization developed its own pantheon and religious practices, yet certain patterns recur. Storm gods held prominence in many cultures, reflecting agricultural concerns. Divine kingship appeared in multiple societies. Beliefs in an afterlife requiring proper burial existed across different cultures. Creation myths often involved divine combat establishing cosmic order. These parallels might result from common human concerns or from cultural transmission through contact. Bronze Age religious traditions influenced later religions, with myths, rituals, and concepts continuing into subsequent periods. The Bronze Age collapse, despite its catastrophic nature, did not represent the end of civilization. These survivors and successors of Bronze Age societies created new civilizations, incorporating Bronze Age achievements while developing new forms of organization and expression. The alphabet developed by Phoenicians made writing more accessible than complex Bronze Age scripts. Iron technology spread widely, eventually surpassing bronze. New religions, including monotheistic traditions, emerged. Greek civilization developed philosophy, democracy, and drama. These post-collapse developments built on Bronze Age foundations even as they moved beyond them. The study of the Bronze Age continues to evolve as new discoveries are made and new analytical techniques are applied. Archaeological excavations uncover new sites and artifacts. Underwater archaeology reveals shipwrecks with their Bronze Age cargoes. Decipherment of ancient scripts opens new texts to study. DNA analysis reveals population movements and relationships. Climate studies reconstruct ancient environmental conditions. Each discovery adds to our understanding of this foundational period. The Bronze Age matters because it shaped the civilizations that followed. The concept of empire originated in Bronze Age Mesopotamia. Legal codes established principles that influenced later law. Writing systems evolved but maintained their essential function. Agricultural techniques developed during the Bronze Age supported populations for millennia. Artistic and architectural traditions showed remarkable continuity. Religious and mythological themes from the Bronze Age appear in later traditions. Understanding the Bronze Age is essential to understanding the development of human civilization. The Bronze Age also offers lessons about civilization's fragility and resilience. The Bronze Age collapse demonstrates that even sophisticated, prosperous civilizations can fail when faced with multiple simultaneous stresses. The complexity and interconnection that brought strength also created vulnerabilities, yet the collapse also shows human resilience and adaptability. Survivors rebuilt, adapted, and eventually created new civilizations. The collapse was traumatic but not permanent, an ending that became a new beginning. For modern audiences, the Bronze Age offers a window into a world both familiar and strange. We recognize the human concerns reflected in Bronze Age sources: the desire for security and prosperity, the love of beauty, the search for meaning, the struggle against mortality. Yet Bronze Age people lived in a world fundamentally different from ours, with different technologies, social structures, and worldviews. Studying the Bronze Age requires imagination to bridge the gap of 3,000 to 5,000 years. The Bronze Age gave us our first glimpses of individual human personalities from the ancient world. We can read the boasts of Sargon of Akkad, the laws of Hammurabi, the prayers of Hittite kings, the diplomatic letters of Egyptian pharaohs. These texts reveal human ambitions, fears, and values. We see rulers concerned with justice, priests seeking divine favour, merchants pursuing profit, and ordinary people trying to live their lives. Despite the vast temporal distance, the fundamental humanity of Bronze Age people comes through in their surviving words and works. The physical remains of Bronze Age civilizations continue to inspire awe. The Egyptian pyramids still stand as testaments to engineering skill and organizational capacity. The walls of Mycenaean Tiryns demonstrate the massive construction projects Bronze Age societies could accomplish. The bronze vessels and weapons in museum collections showcase artistic and technical achievement. The clay tablets with their cuneiform inscriptions preserve the voices of people who lived thousands of years ago. These artifacts connect us tangibly to the Bronze Age world. The Bronze Age was a time of innovation, and achievement, conflict, and transformation. For 2,000 years, bronze technology supported the development of complex civilizations. These societies created monumental architecture, developed writing, established empires, and forged extensive trade networks. They developed legal codes, diplomatic practices, and religious traditions. They produced literature, art, and technological innovations. The Bronze Age civilizations were remarkable achievements of human creativity and organization. Then, around 1200 years before the Common Era, this world largely collapsed. The causes were multiple and interconnected: climate change, invasions, earthquakes, systemic vulnerabilities, internal instability. The collapse was devastating, with cities destroyed, writing systems lost, populations declining, and trade networks disrupted. Yet from the ruins emerged new civilizations that would build on Bronze Age foundations while creating something new. The Bronze Age matters because it was the first age of civilization, the period when humanity first created complex urban societies with writing, centralized states, and extensive trade. Everything that came after built on Bronze Age achievements. The Age of Bronze gave way to the Age of Iron, but the patterns established during the Bronze Age, the fundamental structures of civilization, endured and evolved. Understanding the Bronze Age helps us understand ourselves and the civilizations we inhabit today. This has been the story of the Bronze Age, from the discovery of bronze technology to the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations, spanning civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, and beyond. It was an age of innovation and achievement, of palace civilizations and epic heroes, of trade networks and cultural exchange. It was an age that saw humanity take its first steps toward the complex global civilization we inhabit today. The Bronze Age ended over 3,000 years ago, but its legacy remains with us, woven into the fabric of human civilization.